Welcome back to Hardware Unboxed. It's part 3 Q&A. We're still doing that thing, aren't we?
Yes.
So, September, part 3 Q&A. It's been a lot of fun so far. We're going to get on with answering all of your questions. But before we do, today's sponsor spot is brought to you by Thermal Grizzly and their new 12th Gen CPU contact frame by DeBauer. It's well known that the integrated loading mechanism, or ILM, of the LJ1700 sockets bends 12th Gen CPUs, leading to an uneven contact surface that reduces cooling performance. Solving this issue, the contact frame replaces the ILM, allowing for a much more even contact with the CPU's IHS and the base of your cooler, which in turn reduces operating temperatures. Installation's quick and easy, and thanks to the use of anodized aluminium, the contact frame is non-conductive. And then, for those of you who wish to further maximize contact, Thermal Grizzly now offers an optional lapping tool, so for more information, please check the link in the video description. Alright, with AMD, I don't see a reason why RDNA 1/2 wouldn't be able to support Anti-Lag Plus, nor Polaris and Vega, given Nvidia support reflex on Maxwell. AMD is keeping support to an absolute minimum, so why would one invest in RDNA 3, given that it will probably will have the same short support fate while offering a very reduced feature set and quality on said features versus Nvidia. Alright, did you get that?
Yes, I think they're saying, like, why would you buy RDNA 3 if AMD comes out with new features next generation and doesn't give it to you on RDNA 3, which is sort of what they've done with Anti-Lag Plus.
Kind of like what Nvidia does all the time.
Kind of like what Nvidia does all the time. I think when it comes to, like, restricting features, a lot of it hinges on, like, how good the explanation is for why it's restricted, which I know you kind of can't take companies at their word.
It has to be somewhat convincing.
Yeah, it has to be like a good reason that there's sort of evidence towards.
Plausible.
Like, it's plausible. Like, Nvidia comes out, they make DLSS, and they say it requires tensor cores because it's an AI network and we need the performance of the specific AI instructions that tensor cores provide. Now you could say, okay, well, why didn't they produce an alternate path for DLSS that maybe runs slower and isn't as good that you could run on Pascal? And I think that's a fair point that you could make. But at least NVIDIA is providing a reasonable reason for why they did what they have done. I think with Anti-Lag Plus, AMD hasn't as yet produced a reason that sort of makes sense. They haven't gone, oh, it's this specific RDNA 3 hardware feature, like we integrated this specific Anti-Lag Plus enhancing hardware block or something, and it's only an RDNA 3, and so that's why it's restricted. They've kind of just said, oh, it's some proprietary features that we've got in our new GPUs, and I think there needs to be a bit more digging into exactly what that means, because at the moment they haven't really gone into it enough, in my opinion.
Yeah, so is it either a thing where they're like, we want you to buy RDNA 3, or is it just, it's going to take more time and money to make it work across, a wide range of hardware, and we don't really want to do that because we're trying to get FSR3 out there.
Yeah, I mean, I think a valid reason would be it doesn't perform well on RDNA 1 and 2, therefore we're not going to bother supporting that feature. Whereas I think not a good reason would be, well, we don't want to put in the resources for that because we have no money, we can't be bothered. Like there's one answer is a lot more acceptable than the other answer. And again, it does come down to a lot to how much do you take them at their word for some of these things. So yeah, I would ideally, I think, at least my understanding would be that a feature like Anti-Lag Plus should work on previous generation GPUs, whereas a feature like DLSS maybe not so much. But then there have been NVIDIA features where I feel like maybe they should be running on,
it definitely
on
goes both
generation
ways.
GPUs, or at least putting in a bit more effort to make the features work on previous GPUs. So yeah, I mean, I think as far as like, should you buy RDNA 3 because they may not support this thing in the future, I think it's hard to make any calls about, future support for things. Like, really, you should be buying products based on what they do now, as opposed to the things that you're expecting from them in the future, because it's very hard to predict what exactly is going to be the support and longevity of a product.
Yeah, there's a good chance by the time ray tracing's a night and day type thing, whether current generation GPUs are powerful enough to run it is another thing, but it may not. Those new techniques that make it work so well probably won't even be supported by the current GPUs we have. Like Ray-Reconstruction is one example that we have today. But anyway, or rather, I think frame generation is probably a better one.
But I'm assuming there'll be more of those technologies coming, right? So
yeah,
there's going to be a point
absolutely.
where they don't run on current gen cards, right?
Yeah.
So.
Whether as you say, whether the reasons are justifiable and good or just like, nah, we didn't wanna.
We'll have to assess that on a case-by-case basis. We'll try to keep them honest. We'll try to keep supporters as broad as possible, or at least, look into these sorts of things as it comes.
Mm-hmm. Do you think AMD will try and come out with their own version of Ray-Reconstructing, assuming they start to care about ray tracing performance? Oof.
I think they have to.
Mm-hmm.
I think Ray-Reconstruction will only get better from here. I mean, I'm sort of taking Nvidia at their word on that one, but I think they, as I said in that video, I think they kind of have built up a track record of showing that they do improve these features over time. So I'm more optimistic about them improving Ray-Reconstruction than maybe I was back in the DLSS 1 era, where there sort of wasn't that track record at the time. So I think AMD does need to come out with the feature, and I think they will do it at some point. The question is, are we talking 2025? Are we talking 2030? Are we talking 2035? Because they certainly don't seem to be that keen on getting features out super quick. So it took them a while to get temporal-based super resolution going. It's taken them a while to get FSR3. I think we've made some jokes about how long it's taken them.
Well, it still isn't out.
It still isn't out, which is kind of stupid. But anyway, I think they will. But how much work they've been putting into something like that behind the scenes to begin with is questionable.
Mm-hmm.
If they're starting from scratch now, it's probably going to take a while. So, yeah. If Hardware Unboxed ever has to RMA a product, does one send it back as is in its unboxed form, or do you become Hardware Reboxed to return it? Hardware Reboxed, that's sacrilegious. We're all about unboxing here.
Yeah, we only do unboxing videos, no reboxing videos.
I just, I get the postage label, I just slap it on the product, send it off.
Have you RMA'd a product?
It's a good question, actually.
I don't think I ever have.
There's been... If I'm talking about a product I've bought, I think the answer is probably no. If I'm talking about not necessarily a review sample, but just like hardware that's been provided by a company, I've certainly had products that have shipped in a state that needed to be RMA'd. I got a Gigabyte monitor one time the panel was physically broken after shipping.
Right.
That was not a product I'd bought, but obviously if I'd received that as a
But there's no
consumer,
RMA process for that, obviously.
No.
It's like, give me another one, please.
I've had a motherboard not work.
Mm-hmm.
I've actually had a couple of motherboards not work over the years, but again, those have been products that have been provided.
Mm-hmm.
So, yeah, actually RMAing a product, probably not. Again, it's hard to say because I've been doing this for now, like, enjoying PC gaming for well over a decade. So there's probably products there that I've sent back maybe once or twice.
I think I've been pretty lucky. I don't really have
I've
too many issues. I've tried to melt that many of my 4090s and I can't do it. I feel like a failure. I've tried so hard.
Yeah, just not quite plugging that cable
mate,
in.
some of them they look horrible. And
I mean, I think there's a chance that I will burn in an OLED monitor over time, just from, because at the moment I've been continuing to use the AW3423. DW is my gaming monitor on my system, and I want to see whether it burns in over time using a normal, how I believe someone would use that monitor. And I paid for that monitor. I did buy it, and it does have a 3-year burn-in warranty. So theoretically, if it starts to burn in 2.5 years, you better believe I'll be trying out Dell's burn-in policy and trying to RMA it just to see what happens.
The race is on.
However, at the moment, whether it burns in to that level is, I don't know, it doesn't look like it will. So, yeah, maybe in the future I'll go ham on an OLED and I'll try really destroy it and then try go through an RMA and see what they say.
Fingers crossed you can break your OLED. Alrighty, Tim. Maybe crystal ball, or maybe it's just opinion-based.
Okay.
I guess it is. Do you think PC hardware could go back to more like it was before 2010, where you had to upgrade basically every generation to be able to keep up with performance and technology advances? I'm going to say no to that one.
No. PC gaming is too mainstream now. PC hardware, not PC hardware developers, PC game developers, they're not going to be restricting their game sales to the latest and greatest hardware and forcing people to upgrade. It's really the opposite. They will want to get as many game sales as possible, which means, not necessarily optimizing, but making their games run even at a relatively crappy level on the widest possible user base that they can possibly scope up for their game, scoop up all those people to play. So back in the days when you had to upgrade every generation. It was because these game developers were not exactly expecting millions of sales. PC gaming was much more niche, and the expectations were much more different. Whereas these days, with so many people playing games and them being a significant source of revenue, they sort of need to make different decisions. And that those different decisions are, let's make sure it runs on fairly low-end, mid-tier hardware. So I think, the days of you needing to upgrade, whether or not you will want to upgrade because the experience on high-end products is going to be so much better is, I don't know, maybe that's going to be the case. But, even today, okay, Starfield, for example, doesn't run great on lower tier hardware, but it still does run to some level, as opposed to, I think, back in, the early 2000s, sometimes games just wouldn't run at all. Like they were just, the performance level just wasn't there, or the hardware feature set wasn't there, so the game just wouldn't run. Like you just wouldn't be able to turn on the game at all. So I don't think we're in that situation, but you'd be a bit more familiar with gaming back in the 90s and 2000s than I was.
Yeah, technology in general certainly moved much faster back in the day, but we're going back 20 years or so.
Yeah.
And there's the factors you talked about. There's also the fact that GPU horsepower hasn't exactly come on in leaps and bounds in the last 5 years, and certainly not at the same price points. So you can point to the RTX 4090 all you want and say how amazing it is. Yeah, it's brutally fast, but it's $1,600 US. Good luck finding a $1,600 US graphics card, more than 5 years ago.
Yeah, exactly.
Apart from
a
Titan or whatever, sure. But that was sort of, it's gone from being absolutely absurd and almost no one bought them and almost a meme or a joke to now like it's kind of the must-have graphics card.
Yeah, exactly. So things have changed. Things have come a long way, and I think the current pace that we're at is probably here to stay for a while. I mean, it's pretty crazy when you go back and see like a game released in like 2002 versus 2003 are just like the graphics enhancements that we were getting, the requirement enhancements, like we'd go from low polygon to higher polygon games and things like that. These days it's much more about diminishing returns and more minor improvements, and the hardware pace just hasn't been there. So that's just the way it is these days.
All right, I think we've got a question here that we probably don't normally sort of answer these ones because they're very much, it depends.
Get the merch in the store. We'll put a link below.
All right, Linus. No, kidding. No shade at Linus. It was a joke. For the most recent third-person AAA adventure game titles, what is the minimum CPU you would recommend? So we don't have to, it depends, and go 50 different ways with this. Let's just say you're building a new computer. These are the games you're playing. What's the minimum CPU? Well, really that AM5 or LGA 1700 is what that limits us to, because we don't recommend building an AM4 PC these days.
Yes.
So, I mean, Ryzen 5 7600 or 7500F, they would be the minimum because they're the minimum. But they will play those games really well. And then from Intel,
the equivalent.
I mean, you could probably go like Core i5 like 13400F or something like that would probably work okay. But ideally like a 13600K would be it.
Sounds like a high minimum, but I think,
well, what are the alternatives? Like, you're not going to buy an 11th gen. You're not going to build a new 11th gen or a 10th gen system.
You're not going to build a new AM4 system. I know you can.
Like AM4 5800X 3D, you can get them pretty cheap and all that, but is it that much cheaper than getting a 7600, which is, for the most part, pretty similar gaming performance, newer platform? There is an upgrade path there, whether or not you think that's viable or usable.
Well, I think if someone's asking this question from the perspective of, I want to be playing, the new and upcoming AAA titles, and you kind of have to be thinking about the longevity of the platform a bit. And we're seeing that, 5800X 3D is a great product, but in titles like Starfield, for example, it does struggle in some areas. And you can make the argument that Starfield's not a great optimized game and maybe struggles a bit more than the expectation. But in some of the demanding areas, it's basically like a 60 FPS CPU. And I feel like if you're setting a platform for future gaming, you'd want something that at the very least is playing today's titles at around 90 FPS. So within 2 to 3 years, maybe that drops down more to 60 FPS as games get more intensive, but you're not dropping from 60 to 40 FPS, which is potentially the case with a 5800 X3D type product in the most demanding games. So yeah, I would agree that a newer platform around that sort of Core i5, Ryzen 5 is the level that you'd be looking at that sort of would give you the longevity for the next few years for sort of these upcoming games. And again, we haven't really seen too many examples of games using new engines that are designed specifically and exclusively for next generation consoles. Not a lot of Unreal Engine 5 games still, not a lot of, next generation Frostbite that will only be run on a PS5 or Xbox Series X. So until we get those games, it's kind of a hard question to answer, isn't it?
Yeah, it is.
Yeah, we're sort of basing on very low sample sizes. So I think you'd be a pretty safe bet with something like that, though.
Mm-hmm. Is Cyberpunk a Nvidia tech demo at this point, and reviewers should treat it as more of an outlier when reviewing GPUs? Well, I'm sure you've got something to say about this.
I mean, in some ways, yes, right? Like the Nvidia technologies are quite deeply integrated into the game, and CD Projekt Red do label things like path tracing as a technology preview. So I think it's quite clear that they're not expecting the majority of gamers to be playing the game with those features enabled. Again, it's tech demo. It's a demo, right? You play it for a little bit.
I mean, it's
turn it off. And
that much should be obvious. It works. It works on a 4090 with a few AI helping hands. Mm-hmm. But anyway, sorry, go on.
So, yeah, I mean, I think it's easy to get sort of sucked into taking one example that's got proprietary technology and highly optimized technology for one GPU vendor where there's been this deep integration, and then applying that to the future of gaming. Because if I go back and I think about, let's say, the first ray tracing games that we got with a title like Battlefield 5, for example, which was, I think it was the first ray trace game that we got after, all this talk of new ray tracing capabilities and things. And then you look at the ray tracing in that game and you sort of, if we had applied what we got in that title to and thought, okay, well, this is what we're going to be getting for the future, we would have been wrong. Because after that title came out, developers found new ways to enhance the quality of ray tracing and improve the quality without coming with a performance hit. We got developers who were starting to optimize the performance on not just Nvidia GPUs, but on AMD GPUs as well. So what used to be like an enormous gulf in performance between the two GPU vendors shrunk a bit with newer titles. Certainly that gap is still there, and it does depend on the level of ray tracing that we get. But back with Battlefield 5, even if you ran that on like the original RDNA 2 GPUs, it was like horrific. So I think we can't be drawing too many conclusions out of those types of games because it's unclear how representative they are. There may be a future where all this technology that we're seeing in Cyberpunk runs very differently. In future titles that include path tracing, they may find new ways to optimize path trace rendering with future titles that runs better, in which case it's hard to draw too many conclusions about the performance tiers of cards that you need and the battles between vendors as to how these features run. Because like I said, we would have been burnt hard if we had said that the quality levels and performance of ray tracing in Battlefield 5 was the future, was an example of the future, because it 100% wasn't.
You never would have said that anyway. But also, you're not buying, at least in my opinion, you shouldn't be buying a GPU today with path tracing in mind. Because the Cyberpunk tech demo has proven that the vast majority of current generation RTX GPUs can't do it. Like, the performance just isn't there.
Yeah.
And even with DLSS, upscaling enabled, still not great. Yeah, you can turn on frame generation and arguably it gets there, but I personally do not like that experience. I don't like frame generation in Cyberpunk too much. It's not horrible or unusable, but
I think it's okay if you got a 4090, but if you got like a 4070 or 4060,
you're
the level of performance isn't really there.
Yeah, and that's more what I'm thinking about, because I'm not saying the 4090 can't do it. The 4090 can do it. Whether it's the absolute best experience that game has to offer, guess that depends on how sensitive you are to latency and what your sort of desired frame rate is. If you're someone that has invested in a nice high refresh rate monitor, and you know being able to use the high refresh rate is sort of your priority, then path tracing is not going to be terribly useful to you. But anyway, the point stands that it's not usable on a 4070 or a 4060 or GPUs of that sort of performance tier that came before them.
Yep.
So it's not, path tracing's not all of a sudden in future games going to work on a 4070. That's not how this ever works. And it's what we said back in the day when we were like, you guys were sold the promise of ray-traced games with Turing. Did that pan out? I mean, some people argue that, you know, in certain games it was a game-changing experience. I mean, maybe they can point to one or two examples, like maybe Control or Metro Exodus. Definitely not Battlefield 5. So you've got such a short list of all the potential games that were released where ray-tracing was arguably a bit game-changing, sort of like what we're seeing. That can be the case in Cyberpunk, for example.
Yeah.
But, you know, how useful was that on an RTX 2060 or a 2070? And again, I know there's some people who say it will be, but from my personal experience and what I've observed, definitely not the case. And again, you're not playing Cyberpunk cranked out with, you know, ultra ray tracing on an RTX 2060 years later.
Even on RTX 2080 Ti, it's a challenge, and that was the flagship ray trace card of that generation.
$1,200 GPU.
I think with reviewing products and recommending products, it's not, you're not really doing the buyer a lot of justice and a lot of service if you are too heavily thinking about the promises that something is making. Reviewing is all about what is something doing now? What can we evaluate now that we've got evidence for that is going to inform your experience with that product? If we're saying, okay, in 2 years' time, there's going to be 100 path trace games and the 4090 is going to be the way to experience that. You get to play games at a really high level of performance now, and it's going to run in those games later. That's just a guess.
Like, but it's also bad advice.
Yeah,
because
you could just buy the future card that's going to be even faster.
Well, the 5070, for example, hopefully, I think they're sort of forced to have to offer a performance improvement for the next generation. This was more the feature generation. But history would suggest that you would be better off buying the next generation GPU rather than spending way too much now in the hope that that stuff is available to you.
Yeah, but even let's say that, you know, we were back testing the 4090 when it came out and when the path tracing mode came out. And it's pretty likely at that point that we were 2 years until the next generation. If we could have guessed that there were going to be 100 path trace games or 50 path trace games that were going to come out between the two generations, but it's just like, we don't know. And it becomes a very hard thing to talk about in reviews. It's kind of as well like the fine wine thing with driver improvements. Like, you can't review a product based on a guess that AMD is going to offer 10% more performance via driver improvements in 6 months. Like, that's not a way you should be reviewing products, because you don't know for sure that that's going to happen. It may happen, but it may not happen.
Yeah, like, people were convinced RDNA 3 was going to become way better and hit the goals that AMD originally set. And look, you can point to like Forza Horizon 5 has seen performance improvements, and there's a couple of other titles, but by and large, for the most part, it's pretty much the same as when it was released. Like, there was some obvious driver related problems that have been addressed for some titles, but yeah.
Yeah, so I think when it comes to Cyberpunk and evaluating that, it needs to be weighted in reviews for what it is.
Well,
you weight it as in, it's one game, and if you don't play that game, then it matters. Like, it has zero impact for your buying decision.
That's right. Like, and that's something we really take into consideration, which is why I think it's good that Tim's more single player focused, I'm more multiplayer focused, and we don't end up with a conclusion that's oblivious to multiplayer gaming, for example. Like, we don't really understand multiplayer gaming and their needs and their wants. So we sort of have, and again, why our conclusions are so damn long now, because Tim reads over the conclusions and it's sort of like that covers his perspective of the gaming and then this covers mine. So we're like, if you're this type of gamer, then these are the features and these are the things that will be interesting. If you're this type of gamer, and yeah, you really can't just review a graphics card to a broad audience with just multiplayer in mind or just single player in mind. You got to cover all of those things, which makes it challenging.
And even among that, like, just because I'm a single player gamer doesn't mean that I'd be interested in a title like Cyberpunk. So there's a chance that even if I was interested in single player games, I may never play that, which is why putting too much weight on a feature that's only available in one or a very limited selection of games, I think is, it's questionable the value that brings. Like, it's all like, I fully believe that path trace games is the future of gaming. It's just how much do we weight that in reviews for someone buying a GPU now? Because the reality now is that path tracing is not the experience that you'll be playing in most games. And you could very realistically never play the games that will have path tracing support, in which case you need to weight that appropriately. So, yeah, I mean, I guess, like, despite all this discussion, I don't really have a problem with games coming with features like path tracing in them and with Nvidia and a developer working very closely to show off the technologies that they've got to offer. I don't think that's bad for gaming.
It's really good. It just depends on how you interpret that.
Yeah, it's really good. I think the issue is, like, it's the way that you sell it to people. And this is what we were saying back in the original launch of ray tracing was, if you sell it as a tech demo and you sell it as like, you get a glimpse now of what may be becoming in 5 years from now in terms of the visual quality, hopefully not the performance, but the visual quality side of things, then that is what we're providing to you. But if you're selling it as in like, this is a must-have feature, you need to be paying a huge premium for this feature, then that's when we start to have issues with it and we start to be thinking about how relevant that is for the buyer today.
Yeah, and the performance tier, like, if you're tossing up between, or you're reviewing or comparing a 7900 XTX and RTX 4090, clearly ray tracing and upscaling, that's going to weigh quite heavily on your decision. And path tracing might get a mention there.
Yeah.
But are you going to talk about, does path tracing have any relevance whatsoever for like a RTX 4070 versus 7800 XT?
No.
Yeah, I wouldn't have thought so.
And it likely never will, because that card, like,
doesn't have the horsepower.
Just doesn't have the performance. So, yeah, I mean, like I said, I am personally going to play Cyberpunk Phantom Liberty with path tracing on, just to get my head around the sort of the experience that provides. I've played a little bit of it, but the original path tracing mode when it was brought out to Cyberpunk came out after I'd played through the whole game. I'll be very keen on checking out like Alan Wake 2, which is another title that is going to integrate path tracing, just to sort of see what the experience is offering. But I'm very much going to be approaching it from the perspective of a tech demo, as opposed to, I'm not going to be sitting here coming back to you being like, everyone must play Cyberpunk with this feature enabled, because I'm very much aware that I'm a privileged gamer that's going to be playing with the 4090, right? Like,
I was going to say that. I was like, you're going to review it from the perspective of a privileged YouTuber who uses RTX 4090s as doorstops.
I'm not going to hide the fact that my gaming rig has a 4090. You would have seen me build it on the channel, so you'd be very aware with what I'm using. So, yeah, it'll be interesting to get that. Like, I'm interested not just from like, it's cool to see cool graphics features, from like a work perspective, like, to see what these features are promising and is that going to inform our reviews or anything. So I'll certainly be doing it, but yeah, I don't think it'll be a really key part of our conclusions anytime soon, regardless of what I think of it, just because of the realities of the game support and how taxing it is.
Yeah, and if it's not obvious at this point, or for those people who are new to the channel, when we review a new GPU, we provide you guys with a hopefully detailed day one review. It's not just my opinion where I am biased towards multiplayer gaming, because that's what I predominantly do. And I'm like, yeah, ray tracing sucks, I don't care about it, which isn't too far from the truth with me. Like, I'm not using ray tracing when I play a multiplayer game, even if it supports it. So it's not just my biased multiplayer approach. Like, I write my conclusion, and then I write what I think makes sense for single-player gamers. Then I'm like, Tim, can you read over this? Does this make sense? And if Tim needs to make any corrections or alterations, he'll do that. When it comes to like frame generation and technologies like that, I very much weigh my opinion heavily on Tim's detailed analysis. Of course, I look at these technologies myself. We were, with our video editor, Balin, we were just playing the new Cyberpunk, and we were turning ray tracing on and off. And it was quite a funny experience, because Balin made a few comments about what he finds acceptable, and then we played the game, and then he sort of made some alterations to what he found acceptable based on that like live demo. But the reviews are pretty much a collaboration between Tim and I, so it's not just one person giving you their one opinion on the one style of games they like. We try to make it as broad as possible.
This was asked in a PC Builder Facebook page that I'm a moderator in. Feel sad for you having to moderate a Facebook page. I imagine that's quite a challenge. Anyway, with the uptick of cloud gaming services, how long do you all think it will be until your computer hardware is on the server and you can play a game on a potato? My instant answer to this, and I imagine yours is similar, Steve, is that this will never happen.
Yeah, correct. It will never happen. I mean, we've heard about it. What was it? Was it Stadia was the one that never... Did that never made it to Australia, did it?
No.
It died before it got here.
We have GeForce Now, I think, maybe. Was it GeForce?
GeForce Now is an option. Like, look, they're options. They work. They're just not very good. And I mean, maybe they're okay for like very casual gaming, which is fine. But they're not,
It's never going to be a premium experience. And the reason for that is simply the latency.
Yeah. It's bad enough when you've got to go from your local PC to a server and back.
Yeah, exactly. Or even like streaming in your house can introduce some latency. And, we've talked about, for example, a feature like frame generation it doesn't introduce latency. It just doesn't improve the latency to the level you'd expect from the frame rate increase. So, and that is noticeable in some scenarios, which, any technology that is going to increase latency or hurt latency is going to not be as optimal as playing a game locally with low latency. It simply is not going to be a viable solution for games that require low latency. So first-person shooters, competitive games, racing games, fighting games, all those
even
games.
RTS games, really.
Yeah, any games that require fast-paced action and benefit significantly from your inputs being translated on screen as soon as possible, cloud gaming is never going to provide that solution. And people will say, they can enhance and optimize it. They can to a point, but then it reaches the fundamental laws of physics. Things like the speed of light is one fundamental constraint.
Yeah,
on these
it
things.
also depends where you are and what kind of... Like, if everyone had the world's fastest internet, then it becomes a lot more feasible. But if a lot of people have Australian internet, rural Australian internet, it's like...
But I think it's even with like optimal internet, it becomes... the latency, it is never going to be zero. It's physically impossible for the latency to an offsite server to be zero.
More feasible is what I'm saying. But you're not going to be playing Warzone or whatever on it. So anyway, the answer is no. We've talked about this at length when the Google Stadia thing came out, and there was people that were convinced that you would no longer need a PC. Like the amount of comments we got from people that were convinced this was somehow a new thing, and it went exactly the way we said it would. We did if you could probably find it somewhere, we talked about it at length in the Q&A series. It probably would have been in the title, so you can probably type in Hardware Unboxed, Google Stadia, and the Q&A will come up. You'll be able to find our opinion then, and it turned out to be the case. Yeah, we'll move on.
Yep. Do you think people have become too demanding when it comes to performance in games nowadays? 5 years ago, 50 FPS was considered pretty acceptable in 4K for a 2080 Ti, but nowadays, it seems people lose their minds if games even get much under 80 on a 7900 XTX or 4090, the former being cheaper than the 2080 Ti.
I don't think they've become too demanding. I mean, you've laid out a scenario. I'm just going to take you at your word that that's a realistic scenario. I'm not exactly sure. I've not found 50 FPS at 4K to be satisfactory, and I've been gaming at 4K for quite a long time. I will sacrifice visual quality to get my desired frame rate. We've talked about this time and time again, and we've talked about this in like how to benchmark type videos and stuff like that. But I think maybe it's become a bit more noticeable because whereas previously those people or the people seeking high frame rates were like, and I'm going back a long time, forgive me, were like your Quake Rocket Arena type players and stuff like that, like your multiplayer players that would, reduce visual quality settings in the hope of more FPS or, buy the latest and greatest hardware because they wanted as much, frame rate as possible. And then that shifted into what probably a bit more mainstream with more affordable high refresh rate monitors. Do you think that's fair? Like people, and because when people were doing this in Rocket Arena, we were at 60 hertz for the most part. Like 75 hertz was high refresh rate gaming back then, but it wasn't about that so much. It's just that you've made a video explaining why going above your refresh rate can improve input and all that sort of stuff.
Yep.
So I think maybe, because once you've tried 144 hertz and you've had above 100 FPS, it is so much better. Like, I know there are people that can't tell the difference, apparently, or they don't think it's that much difference, but I think by and large, you pluck someone out randomly and say, here, play Cyberpunk at 60 FPS. And then you say, now play it at 120 FPS. They're like, wow, this feels so much better, looks better, is smoother, it's just more enjoyable overall. I think more people have just sampled that, whether it be in like a simple game like Rocket League or a more demanding game. They've now sampled high refresh rate gaming. They've invested, and like when you've spent good money on a high refresh rate monitor, you don't want to be playing games at 50 FPS anymore. Like, it's almost torture. If you've come from a console and you've stepped up to PC gaming with the improved visuals and everything at 60 FPS, you're probably sitting there thinking, this is amazing. Like, this is a great experience. But if you've gone up to that well over 100 FPS and then you're coming back down, it's not great.
Yeah, and I think as well, like, it's totally fair that 5 years ago we would have different standards to today. Like, we want things to be advancing over time. Like, we want higher resolutions and higher frame rates and better visual quality across all areas. It shouldn't just be one of those elements.
Especially if you're paying a lot more as well.
Yeah, exactly. So if you're paying more, hardware's much faster and more advanced than it was previously. So you would be expecting that naturally over time, these cards are going to be more capable of running at higher frame rates. And I guess you could make the argument that maybe some gamers would want more of the visual improvements and less of the frame rate improvements, or more of the resolution improvements. Like, your preferences will vary there. But I think generally you'd expect a balance across all of those areas to improve for all things. So as we get more powerful hardware, we're going to go from 1440p to 4K, and we're going to go from 60 to 90 FPS, and we're going to get better looking games across all areas. So yeah, 5 years ago, standards were different. And I think as well, the console thing comes back to it as well, because the previous generation of consoles, like PS4 era, there were many more games that only ran at 30 FPS. So the PC enhanced experience often would be 60 FPS. Whereas now, there are still some games that only run at 30 FPS, unfortunately, but there are a lot more console games that are hitting a 60 FPS, or at least give you the option of a 60 FPS performance mode. So then the PC experience, the enhanced, more expensive premium experience, because PCs are expensive, becomes high refresh rate. We need things like 80 to 90 FPS and high visual quality and things like that, because otherwise, wouldn't you just buy a console if you're okay with like 60 FPS and moderate level visual quality? Of course, PC has a bunch of other advantages, but just for argument's sake, right? The console experience would be fine. So yeah, I don't think it's unreasonable for gamers these days buying high-end products to be demanding 90 FPS, 80 FPS at 4K from those cards, because that's where we should be at, really.
Yeah, like I said, 5 years ago, most people probably had a 60 hertz display. Whereas I think most people, I'm not saying all gamers or most gamers, but most people who have upgraded their computer in a significant way over the last few years, bought a new monitor, they likely have more than 60 hertz. Like, it'd be 120, 144, 165, something like that.
Some people have been very annoyed that I've mentioned in the past that I believe 60 hertz is a low refresh rate now.
Oh, so bad.
You know, people have said, there's still gaming at 30 FPS and a majority of TVs are 60 hertz, which I understand. I think for PC gaming and monitors, though, when you're buying a product today, you would largely not be considering a 60 hertz monitor. They're not worth buying.
They're
like going from 1080p 60 hertz to 1080p 144 hertz doesn't cost that much more. Of course, you can get the super low end, honestly garbage quality 1080p 60 hertz monitors if you really want to, but 1080p 144 hertz is $150 or less. You can get it for $120 at times these days. It's very affordable. And of course, some people, even $120 can be too much. I understand that, but the majority of people buying a monitor right now are buying a high refresh rate monitor.
I'm not scoffing at people not spending money, right? Like, if you can't afford it, that's fine. We're not trying to shame. If you're limited to 60 hertz, we're not trying to shame you or go, oh my God, what are you doing with your life? That's not the case at all. This is a complete money is removed from the equation. We're purely talking about it from a technology standpoint. And the difference between 60 hertz and 144 hertz cannot be overstated enough. Like, it just cannot be. Like, forget about gaming.
The desktop apps are way better.
If for some reason my desktop reverts back to maybe after a driver update or something goes wrong and it reverts back to 60 hertz on a panel, the second I move the mouse, it's like, whoa, what is going on here? And then you change it to 144 and it's like, oh, that's so much better. Like, and we're talking about just desktop usage. I pick it, if I jump on a computer with a 60 hertz display, the second I move the mouse, it's crazy. So from a technology standpoint, 60 hertz is horrible, 144 is miles better. But of course, if you can't afford it or you don't want to upgrade yet, we're not shaming you or saying, what are you doing? It's just, they're two different things. One is what you have and what you can get, and the other one is just, we're just merely stating the facts from a technology standpoint.
Yeah, and the low refresh rate comment is just the facts of the market as it stands right now. The majority of monitors support over 60 hertz, so I don't see why that should be classed as sort of a moderate refresh rate. The medium point in the market today is now what used to be labelled as a high refresh rate monitor. So that is definitely going to impact the buying discussions for people and what becomes acceptable. We're talking 4090 buyers. Like, we're talking people with high-end GPUs. You know, the discussion point about refresh rates could even be made that 240 hertz is sort of a standard for what someone in that price class is aiming for, given the monitors that are available around that sort of class. You're certainly looking at well above 120 FPS, 120 hertz today.
I was going to give this topic a bit more fuel, but we might get into that a bit later. We'll move on to the next question because we've probably addressed this one enough at this point. All right, Tim. We're done.
Yep.
You can go home now.
I will. See ya.
All right, see you, Tim. Actually, no. We're going to do an hour-long live stream for our Patreon and Floatplane members now.
That's right. Yeah, looking forward to that. Yeah, it's been a while since we've done one because of Steve getting sick last time. And
bloody Steve.
Yeah, what else is there to say?
I guess we'll
Patreon.
We'll wrap it up. Floatplane, Patreon, links in the video description if you want more Hardware Unboxed goodness. If you want to catch Tim and I on our hour-long live streams or hour-plus long live streams where we chat with you guys, talk a bit of crap, give you guys a hard time, and give us some money, and we'll do that for you. Floatplane, Patreon. There's also behind-the-scenes content, exclusive Discord server, and more Q&A stuff. So anyway, I guess just check that out. If you're not interested, that is fine. I won't hold it against you. Tim probably will, but
at least check out the podcast.
Go
more
check
free content from us.
That's free content. So
go check that out. And
we're not trying to fleece you on every front. I'm your host.
We really sell our stuff, don't we? I'm your host, Tim. See you next time.